Barack and Michelle Obama boarded a first-class flight, hoping for a peaceful flight, but faced humiliation and discrimination. Their response to the injustice caused a real public outcry. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The steady hum of engines vibrated faintly through the glass walls of the JFK International Airport. Sunlight streamed in through the massive panes, reflecting off polished tile floors and casting long shadows of hurried travelers dragging wheeled luggage. Baggage carts squeaked, and muffled announcements echoed overhead. But to Michelle Obama, the noise felt strangely distant, as though her mind had filtered it out to focus on the moment ahead. She glanced at Barack, who stood beside her with his hands resting loosely in the pockets of his crisp navy slacks. He looked relaxed, but Michelle noticed the subtle crease between his brows, a telltale sign that he was thinking, calculating, always aware of the currents around him. "This should be easy," he said, catching her glance and offering a quick smile. Michelle wanted to believe that. After months of speeches, conferences, and relentless travel, they'd carved out a brief window for themselves, a rare opportunity to unwind without cameras or schedules. A first-class flight to Los Angeles and a few days to breathe. No meetings, no appearances, just time for each other. But even as Barack squeezed her hand gently, she couldn't shake the unease building inside her. They stepped up to the check-in counter, and Michelle immediately felt it. The shift in tone, the hesitation in the attendant's voice. The woman, who wore a sleek uniform with gold epaulets on her shoulders, greeted them with a forced smile that barely touched her eyes. "Good afternoon," she said, straightening. "I'll just need your passports and tickets." Barack handed over the documents, and Michelle watched as the woman's gaze lingered longer than necessary. She flipped through the pages of their passports, pausing on each one as though expecting to find something amiss. "These are for first class?" the attendant asked, glancing up. Barack's smile didn't waver, though Michelle noticed the slight shift in his tone. "Yes, confirmed seats. Is there a problem?" "Oh, no problem," the woman replied, but her fingers tapped against the keyboard with what felt like deliberate slowness. After a long pause, she looked up again. "I just need to double-check a few details." Michelle exchanged a glance with Barack. It wasn't the first time they'd faced delays disguised as routine checks, but it stung all the same. She fought the instinct to demand an explanation, knowing that the slightest show of frustration could easily be misread, turned against them. Minutes dragged by. Other passengers in the first-class line breezed through the process, receiving warm smiles and light-hearted banter from staff. Meanwhile, Michelle felt the weight of eyes, both those of strangers watching and the attendants, flicking between her and the screen. Finally, the woman handed back their documents. "You're all set," she said. The words sounded forced, like she didn't quite believe them herself. As they walked toward security, Michelle kept her voice low. "Did you see how she looked at us, like we didn't belong there?" Barack exhaled softly. "I saw it, but don't let it get to you. We're here to relax, remember?" Michelle nodded, though the tension in her chest refused to ease. The security checkpoint offered no reprieve. After removing their shoes, belts, and watches, they stepped into the body scanners, where Michelle endured yet another prolonged inspection. A TSA agent, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline, gestured for her to step aside. "Random check," he said, though his tone made it feel anything but random. Michelle raised her arms as he ran a metal detector along her body, then patted down the seams of her dress. She said nothing, but her mind raced. Random checks, prolonged stares, pointed questions. She knew the pattern too well. When they finally reached the gate, Michelle's nerves were frayed. She tried to focus on Barack's steady presence, his ability to deflect tension with humor and charm. But even he seemed more guarded than usual, his gaze flickering toward the other passengers as they waited to board. A group of businessmen in tailored suits sat nearby, laughing over drinks. One of them, a silver-haired man with a Rolex that caught the light, kept glancing at Michelle and Barack. His expression wasn't overtly hostile, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes that made Michelle's skin prickle. When boarding began, the tension sharpened. A second attendant at the gate scanned their tickets, pausing once again. "First class?" she asked, as though she couldn't believe it. "Yes," Michelle said, and for the first time her voice carried an edge. The woman blinked but didn't comment further, waving them through. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Michelle exhaled sharply. "I don't know if I can do this for 5 hours," she whispered. Barack rested a hand on her lower back. "We'll handle it," he said softly, "just like always." But Michelle wasn't so sure. The cabin of the plane gleamed with polished wood and plush white leather seats. Soft lighting bathed the space in warmth, and flute glasses of champagne glinted on trays. It was designed to feel exclusive, luxurious, and yet Michelle felt the opposite. A woman in pearls turned in her seat, her eyes lingering just long enough for Michelle to feel the judgment before she turned away. Michelle sat beside Barack, her shoulders stiff. She wanted to disappear into her seat, but she also wanted to stand up and shout at every person who dared to look at her like she didn't belong. A blonde flight attendant approached. "Can I get you something to drink?" Michelle's voice stayed steady. "Water, please." The attendant gave a clipped nod and disappeared. Michelle waited. Minutes passed. The flight attendant returned several times, refilling glasses of champagne for the other passengers, but she never brought Michelle's water. When Michelle finally flagged her down again, the woman's smile was tight. "Oh, sorry about that. I'll bring it right over." But she didn't. Michelle leaned back in her seat, her fists clenched in her lap. "This is what you meant by handling it?" Barack's eyes darkened, but his voice remained calm. "Not yet," he said, "but we will." As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, Michelle stared out the window, her reflection caught against the fading skyline. She thought of her parents, of the lessons they'd taught her about dignity and resilience. She thought of the countless times she'd faced prejudice, from college classrooms to boardrooms. But most of all, she thought of the fight ahead. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, a familiar, ugly pattern, and Michelle knew that before the flight was over, that pattern would be broken. She glanced at Barack, who was already reaching for his phone, setting it to record. They weren't going to let this slide. Not this time. Michelle sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but it wasn't enough to drown out the tension coiling in her chest. Through the corner of her eye, she caught glimpses of other passengers, glimpses she had learned to read all too well. A middle-aged woman in a tailored blazer sat 2 rows ahead, sipping champagne as she flipped through a glossy magazine. Every so often, her eyes darted backward, lingering on Michelle and Barack before flicking away again, as if the sight of them in first class required repeated verification. Michelle shifted in her seat, resisting the urge to confront the woman outright. She knew the look. It wasn't loud or hostile, but it carried the same weight, a quiet message of exclusion, reinforced by each glance and whisper. Barack sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, his expression calm but focused. She envied his ability to maintain composure, even when the atmosphere around them felt charged. The blonde flight attendant returned, gliding down the aisle with practiced elegance. She stopped at the row in front of them, leaning down to refill the champagne glasses of a young couple. Her voice was warm and lilting as she exchanged pleasantries, offering them a selection of hors d'oeuvres from a silver tray. Michelle's stomach tightened. When the flight attendant turned toward their row, her demeanor shifted. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice flatter now. Michelle's lips parted, but Barack spoke first. "My wife asked for water earlier," he said, his tone steady but edged with irritation. "It still hasn't arrived." The flight attendant blinked, as though only just remembering the request. "Oh, right," she said quickly. "I'll bring it over." Michelle watched her retreat, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "This isn't just forgetfulness," Michelle muttered. "Did you see how she looked at us?" Barack nodded but didn't look away from his phone. "I saw it." "And you're just going to let it slide?" "For now," he said. "Let's keep watching." Michelle bit back her frustration. She hated waiting, hated the way these moments lingered, leaving her to simmer in indignation. But she knew Barack's strategy well. He wanted to gather evidence, to let the pattern build until there was no denying it. Another 10 minutes passed. The water never came. Instead, Michelle watched the flight attendant hover near a group of businessmen 3 rows ahead, laughing as one of them gestured toward her shoulder, likely complimenting her uniform. She lingered there, leaning in close as though she were one of them, part of their world. Michelle's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of her parents' lessons about dignity and restraint, but her patience was wearing thin. When the flight attendant finally reappeared, carrying the requested water, Michelle's smile was tight. "Thank you," she said, accepting the glass. The woman nodded curtly, then turned without another word. Barack set down his phone, leaning slightly toward Michelle. "Did you hear what she said to the couple behind us?" he asked quietly. Michelle shook her head. "She told them it's refreshing to have normal people flying today." Michelle's breath caught. "She didn't." "She did," Barack confirmed, his voice steady but his eyes sharp. Michelle's mind raced. She replayed the past hour, the double-checking of their tickets, the delay in service, the pointed comments. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. She looked over at Barack, whose phone was angled slightly upward, its camera lens discreetly pointed toward the aisle. "We have enough," he said. But Michelle wasn't ready to let it go. She stood, stepping into the aisle as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. The slight jolt didn't deter her. She made her way toward the galley, ignoring the eyes that followed her. The flight attendant was there, chatting with another crew member, a man who wore a crisp uniform and an expensive watch that caught the overhead light. Michelle waited for the woman to notice her. "Oh," the flight attendant said, straightening. "Can I help you with something?" "Yes," Michelle said, keeping her voice even. "I'd like to understand why my husband and I have been treated differently than the other passengers in this cabin." The attendant's eyes flicked to her colleague, then back to Michelle. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. "I think you do," Michelle replied. "We've been ignored, delayed, and spoken to like we don't belong here, and now I hear you've been calling other passengers normal people." The woman flushed. "That's not what I meant." Michelle didn't back down. "Then explain what you did mean." The attendant's colleague stepped forward. "Ma'am, I think you're overreacting," he said, his tone condescending. Perhaps this isn't the right environment for you if you're feeling uncomfortable. Michelle's pulse quickened. You're right about one thing, she said. This isn't the right environment for behavior like this. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her heart pounding. When she reached her seat, Barack looked up, his face a mixture of pride and concern. That was risky, he said. I couldn't let it go, Michelle replied, sitting down heavily. Barack reached for her hand. I know. The rest of the flight dragged on. Michelle felt the stares from other passengers, the subtle whispers that followed her confrontation. But she also felt something else, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. When the plane finally began its descent, Michelle's thoughts shifted. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She turned to Barack. We're not letting this slide, she said. His eyes met hers, steady and sure. Agreed. As the wheels touched down, Michelle braced herself. This wasn't just about a single flight. It was about a larger fight, one she knew they couldn't afford to lose. Michelle felt the plane's subtle shudder as it began to descend through a patch of turbulence. The cabin lights flickered slightly, and a murmur passed through the passengers. Yet the unease she felt had nothing to do with the bumps in the air. The weight of the confrontation in the galley lingered. Her pulse had steadied, but the tension sat like a stone in her chest. She could feel the eyes still on her, the curious, judgmental stares of passengers who had overheard her words, or worse, simply witnessed her daring to speak up. Barack sat beside her, scrolling through the footage on his phone. He hadn't said much since she'd returned to her seat, but his hand occasionally brushed against hers, a small act of reassurance. Michelle looked at him, her voice low. What's the plan? Barack glanced up, his eyes sharp and focused. We wait, he said. We let them keep talking. She wanted to argue. She wanted action, not patience. But she knew Barack's strategy. He had spent years navigating rooms filled with people who underestimated or dismissed him. He understood how to let arrogance and bias reveal themselves. Still, Michelle wasn't convinced that waiting would be enough this time. The flight attendant reappeared, carrying a tray of drinks. Michelle tensed as the woman approached, but this time she bypassed their row completely, moving straight to the couple seated ahead of them. Another glass of champagne? The attendant asked sweetly. Michelle's grip on her armrest tightened. Barack shifted slightly, lifting his phone just enough to capture the moment. She's making it too easy, he murmured. Michelle wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The absurdity of it all, the blatant favoritism, the thinly veiled hostility, was almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, jolting slightly. The champagne in the glasses ahead of them sloshed over the rims, and the flight attendant let out a small, nervous laugh. Oops, looks like it's going to be a bumpy landing, she said. Michelle glanced at Barack. Bumpy for some of us more than others, she muttered. Barack leaned in. We're not done yet. And then the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Los Angeles. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Michelle thought she might finally be able to breathe, but as the flight attendant returned to collect empty glasses, she paused beside their row. Make sure your seatbelt is secure, she said, addressing Michelle directly. Her voice carried an edge. Michelle forced herself to smile. Thank you, she said, her tone polite but firm. The woman hesitated, then stepped away. Barack lowered his phone and exhaled. Did you catch that? Michelle asked. Every word. As the plane descended, the tension in the cabin seemed to thicken. The businessmen in the front rows continued to chat and laugh, oblivious or unconcerned about the undercurrent of hostility. But Michelle's thoughts kept circling back to the confrontation in the galley. She replayed the flight attendant's words, the pilot's smirking dismissal, the looks from other passengers. It wasn't just the service, or lack of it. It was the sense of being reduced, diminished, made to feel like an outsider even in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. Michelle thought about her parents, how hard they had worked to give her opportunities they never had. She thought about the countless times she'd been told to be grateful or to stay in her place. She wasn't staying silent this time. The plane touched down with a bump, and the passengers broke into scattered applause. Michelle felt the wheels roll to a stop, but the sense of motion didn't leave her. The flight might be over, but this fight had only begun. The door to the cabin opened, and the first-class passengers began to gather their bags. Michelle stood, brushing non-existent wrinkles from her dress as she stepped into the aisle. The blonde flight attendant was waiting near the exit, her smile tight and practiced. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, avoiding eye contact. Michelle met her gaze and held it. "Thank you," Michelle said. Her voice carried a weight the woman couldn't ignore. Barack stepped beside her, his presence steadying Michelle's resolve. As they walked through the jet bridge, the murmurs began again. Michelle caught snippets, fragments of conversations that made her stomach churn. Did you see how she acted? Entitled. Looking for trouble. Michelle's shoulders tensed, but Barack placed a hand lightly on her back. "Keep walking," he murmured. They emerged into the terminal, where the crowd thinned slightly. Michelle let out a slow breath, but before she could speak, 2 uniformed airport security officers approached. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama?" Michelle froze. "Yes," Barack replied calmly. "We need to check your bags again," one of the officers said. Michelle's heart sank. "Is there a problem?" Barack asked. "It's just a routine security measure," the officer said, but the words rang hollow. Michelle opened her mouth to argue, but Barack spoke first. "We'll cooperate," he said. Michelle swallowed her frustration and followed the officers to a secondary screening area. It was humiliating. They stood there as strangers rifled through their belongings, opening bags and checking compartments as if searching for evidence of wrongdoing. Michelle couldn't stay silent any longer. "This isn't random," she said, her voice sharp. "Ma'am, it's just protocol," one officer replied. "No," Michelle said. "It's not, and you know it." The officer hesitated but didn't respond. Barack touched her arm lightly, signaling her to step back. "Let them finish," he said quietly. Michelle turned away, her face burning. She wanted to scream. Instead, she bit her lip and waited. When the search was finally over, the officers handed back their bags without apology. "You're free to go," one of them said. Michelle didn't move. Barack nodded, thanking the officers before gently steering her toward the exit. Once they were out of earshot, Michelle exhaled sharply. "I'm done being polite," she said. Barack looked at her. "So am I." Michelle glanced at his phone. "We have what we need?" "We have enough," Barack replied. Michelle's resolve hardened. "This isn't over," she said. Barack smiled faintly. "No, it's not." As they stepped into the terminal, Michelle felt the weight of what lay ahead. But she also felt something else, determination. They weren't letting this go. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway, jolting Michelle slightly in her seat as the aircraft slowed. She exhaled, trying to release the tension coiled in her chest, but it lingered, tight and unyielding. Beside her, Barack sat upright, his phone resting in his hand as if it had become an extension of him. The screen was dark now, but Michelle knew the evidence it held could ignite a firestorm. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Michelle stared out the window. The lights of the Los Angeles International Airport stretched out like a grid of stars, artificial and cold. She should have felt relief to finally be back on solid ground, but instead, a heavy knot formed in her stomach. She turned to Barack. "What happens next?" He glanced at her, his expression calm but edged with resolve. "We let them show their hand." Michelle frowned. "And what if they don't?" "They already have." The quiet certainty in his voice steadied her, but only slightly. Michelle wasn't used to letting things unfold at their own pace. She was a fighter, someone who faced problems head on. The waiting, the recording, the silent observation. It was a strategy she understood but struggled to embrace. The seatbelt light dinged off. Around them, passengers began unbuckling, standing to retrieve bags from the overhead bins. The hum of conversation swelled, but Michelle caught fragments that made her pulse quicken. "I don't see what the big deal was," one man muttered. "They're lucky to even be here," a woman replied in a hushed voice. Michelle closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and stood. She wouldn't let them see her hesitate. She wouldn't let them think they had won. Barack stood beside her, resting a hand lightly on the small of her back as they stepped into the aisle. The blonde flight attendant was positioned near the exit, her professional smile looking thinner than before. Michelle locked eyes with her, searching for even a flicker of remorse, but found only polite detachment. "Thank you for flying with us," the woman said, her tone mechanical. Michelle didn't respond. Neither did Barack. They stepped onto the jet bridge, but before they could take more than a few steps, two uniformed security officers appeared, blocking their path. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama?" one of them asked. Michelle's heart sank. "Yes?" Barack's voice was steady. "We need you to come with us for an additional screening," the officer said. His tone was calm, almost apologetic, but Michelle recognized the routine. Too well rehearsed, too convenient. "What's the issue?" Barack asked. "Just a standard procedure," the second officer said quickly. Michelle's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't standard," she said before Barack could stop her. "We both know that." "Ma'am, we need your cooperation." Michelle opened her mouth to argue, but Barack touched her arm. "Let's go," he said quietly. They followed the officers through the terminal, past curious onlookers who craned their necks to get a better look. Michelle's skin prickled as the whispers followed them. "Are they in trouble?" "Looks like it." "They always play the victim." Michelle swallowed hard. The humiliation simmered under her skin, but she kept her head high. The secondary screening area was tucked away from the main terminal. It was small and sterile, with white walls and bright fluorescent lights. Two security agents, a man and a woman, stood behind a counter. "Place your bags on the table," the male officer instructed. Michelle hesitated, but Barack gave her a slight nod. She set her carry-on down, stepping back as the officers unzipped it and began rifling through her belongings. They pulled out clothes, toiletries, and a book she had tucked inside. The female officer turned the pages as if expecting to find something hidden between them. "This is ridiculous," Michelle muttered. The male officer glanced at her but didn't respond. Barack stood close, his presence steadying her even as her anger simmered. Finally, after several long minutes, the officers stepped back. "You're clear," one of them said, almost begrudgingly. "Of course we are," Michelle snapped, but Barack gently touched her arm, guiding her away. They walked out of the screening area, their bags hastily repacked. But the weight of the moment pressed down on Michelle. She felt exposed, stripped bare under the scrutiny. As they moved through the terminal, Barack pulled out his phone. "It's time," he said. Michelle nodded. Barack uploaded the first clip, the conversation with the flight attendant where she dismissed Michelle's concerns. Within minutes, the video began gaining traction, comments flooding in. "Unacceptable behavior. I can't believe this still happens. Hold them accountable." Michelle refreshed the feed, watching as the views climbed. But then came the backlash. Typical. Always playing the race card. They should have flown private if they didn't want to deal with the rest of us. Entitled and oversensitive. Michelle felt her pulse quicken again. "Do you see this?" she asked, showing Barack the comments. "I see it," he said, his voice calm. "And I expected it." "That doesn't make it easier." "No," he agreed, "but it means we're being heard." The airline released a statement within hours. "We are aware of the concerns raised by Mr. and Mrs. Obama and take these allegations very seriously. We are conducting a full review of the incident and remain committed to provide an excellent service to all our customers." Michelle snorted when she read it. "This is damage control, not accountability." "Not yet," Barack said. Later that evening, as they settled into their hotel, Michelle stared at the phone in her hand. Messages poured in from friends, strangers, journalists. Some offered support. Others questioned their motives. A notification popped up, a direct message from someone identifying herself as a flight attendant who used to work for the airline. "They train us to treat certain passengers differently," the message read, "especially when they don't fit the image we're supposed to project." I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Michelle's breath caught. She handed the phone to Barack. "This is bigger than us," she said. Barack nodded. "Let's make sure everyone sees that." The weight in Michelle's chest began to ease, not because the fight was over, but because it had begun in earnest. They weren't alone, and they weren't backing down. The glow of the hotel room cast soft shadows across the walls as Michelle paced near the window. The city outside bustled with lights and motion, but the hum of life beyond the glass only made the tension in her chest feel sharper. Her phone vibrated for what felt like the 100th time that evening, yet she couldn't bring herself to look at the screen. Barack sat at the small desk in the corner, his fingers moving steadily over his laptop keyboard. His expression was calm, but Michelle could see the slight furrow in his brow, a crack in the facade he always wore during moments like this. "They're spinning it," Michelle said, stopping mid-step. Barack didn't look up. "Of course they are." Michelle crossed her arms, staring at the headline splashed across her phone screen. Obama's accuse airline of racism. Critics call it overreaction. Luxury flight scandal. Entitlement or injustice. Former president and first lady claim discrimination. Spark backlash. She clenched her jaw, scrolling through the comments. "They're trying to make it about us," she muttered. "Like we're the problem, not the system." Barack finally looked up, his calm gaze meeting hers. "They're scared," he said simply. "They wouldn't be pushing back this hard if they weren't." Michelle exhaled and sank into the chair across from him. But what if that's all people see? What if the noise drowns out the truth? Barack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "We don't let it. That's why we keep pushing." Michelle nodded, but the weight of the day, the stares, the whispers, the security checks, pressed down on her. She thought about the flight attendant who had sent the message earlier. She thought about the countless people who didn't have the platform she and Barack had. "We need more," she said suddenly. Barack raised an eyebrow. "More what?" "More voices, more stories. We can't let this be about just us. It has to be bigger." Barack sat back, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said after a moment. "We need to find others who've been through this." Within hours, Michelle's words took root. Their team began reaching out. Former employees, passengers who had come forward in the comments, and advocacy groups who had been fighting these battles long before the Obamas stepped onto that plane. The next morning, the floodgates opened. Stories poured in, accounts of missed upgrades, unexplained security checks, and dismissive treatment. Former airline employees described unspoken rules about maintaining the exclusivity of first class and managing the image of passengers. One former flight attendant went public, revealing internal memos about prioritizing preferred clientele and subtly discouraging bookings from certain demographics. The language was coded but unmistakable. Michelle read every word, her stomach twisting with anger and determination. Barack sat beside her as they scrolled through the stories, their phones lighting up with messages from reporters and activists. "This is bigger than one flight," Michelle said, her voice tight. Barack nodded. "It always was." The airline's response came swiftly. A second statement appeared online, carefully worded but still deflecting blame. "We take these concerns seriously and are committed to diversity and inclusion. We will be conducting an internal review to ensure all policies reflect our values." Michelle tossed her phone onto the table. "This means nothing," she said. "It's a distraction," Barack agreed. And then the lawsuit arrived. A thick envelope was delivered to their hotel suite, formal, threatening, and full of legal jargon designed to intimidate. The airline accused them of defamation, demanding a retraction and apology. Michelle stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. "They're doubling down," she said. Barack's voice was calm but firm. "Let them." They called their legal team immediately. "We're not backing down," Michelle said, before the lawyers could even start explaining their options. The team began drafting their defense, building a case not just around their experience, but around the stories of others who had suffered in silence. Michelle and Barack also reached out to trusted journalists, giving interviews that focused on the broader issue. Not just their own treatment, but the systemic patterns of exclusion and discrimination revealed by the investigation. Michelle's voice trembled slightly during the first interview, but she didn't let it falter. "This isn't about one flight," she said. "This is about who we are as a society, about the invisible lines we draw and the spaces we decide to keep closed, and we're not going to let this be swept under the rug." The interview went viral. People began sharing their own experiences. Hashtags emerged. #equal access, #not just a seat, #change in the air, trending worldwide. Michelle scrolled through the responses late into the night, her heart aching at the sheer volume of stories. A mother who had been asked to move to the back of the plane so a white family could sit together. A businessman who had been escorted off a flight after questioning why his meal hadn't arrived when everyone else had been served. A flight attendant who had quit after being reprimanded for being too friendly to passengers of color. It was overwhelming, but it also strengthened her resolve. Barack's phone buzzed with another notification. "The airline's CEO is going on TV tomorrow," he said. Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, damage control." "Probably." The CEO's interview did exactly what they expected. He dismissed the accusations as misunderstandings, and insisted the company's record spoke for itself. But then something happened that the CEO hadn't planned for. A whistleblower came forward, one of the airline's senior managers. The manager leaked internal emails detailing how the company tracked high-risk passengers and provided training on how to subtly discourage them from returning. Michelle and Barack read the emails in stunned silence. "They didn't even try to hide it," Michelle said. Barack shook his head. "They didn't think anyone would ever call them out." The fallout was immediate. The emails dominated headlines. The airline's stock plummeted. Activists called for boycotts. The CEO resigned within days. Michelle sat in their hotel room, staring at the screen as the news broke. "We did this," she said softly. Barack turned to her, his expression serious. "No," he said. "They did this. We just made sure everyone saw it." Michelle leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up to her. But even as she let herself breathe, she knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Michelle sat in the quiet of their living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Rain pattered against the windows, rhythmic and steady, but inside, the tension was anything but calming. She scrolled through the endless flood of messages and notifications on her phone, the screen glowing as article after article detailed the scandal that had exploded into public view. The fallout had been swift and relentless. The airline's CEO had resigned under pressure, the internal emails leaked by a whistleblower laying bare the company's discriminatory practices. Boycotts had been organized, protests held outside airport terminals, and former employees were coming forward in droves to share their stories. But it wasn't over. Michelle set her phone down and looked across the room at Barack, who was seated at the dining table, his laptop open and glowing faintly in the dim light. He glanced up at her, his expression steady but weighed down by exhaustion. "More emails just surfaced," he said. Michelle sat up straighter. "What do they say?" "They confirm what we already knew," Barack replied. "Management instructed staff to prioritize certain passengers based on their profile. It's all coded, of course, but it's there, plain as day." Michelle felt a spark of vindication, but it was tempered by something heavier, a sense of responsibility that had only grown as the scandal unfolded. "We can't let them sweep this under the rug," she said. Barack nodded. "We won't." The next morning brought another round of headlines. Airline scandal unveils culture of bias and discrimination. Former employees speak out. We were told to discourage certain passengers. CEO resigns amid backlash, promises reform. But is it enough? Michelle watched the news coverage with a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The airline had issued yet another statement promising sweeping changes, new diversity training programs, reviews of hiring practices, and policies designed to foster inclusivity. But Michelle had seen enough performative gestures to know the difference between real reform and damage control. That afternoon, their legal team sent a formal response to the airline's lawsuit. It was bold, unapologetic, and filled with evidence that dismantled the company's claims of innocence. Michelle read every line carefully, her heart pounding as she imagined the courtroom battles ahead. But it wasn't the lawsuit that worried her most. It was the broader fight, the systemic changes that would take more than headlines and resignations to achieve. Later that evening, Michelle and Barack hosted a private meeting with activists, advocates, and former airline employees who had come forward. The gathering was held in a small conference room, the air thick with determination. Lucia, the former flight attendant who had sent Michelle that first message, sat nervously at the edge of the table. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said softly. Not really. Michelle reached across the table, taking Lucia's hand in hers. You gave us the courage to act, Michelle said, and now we need to make sure this doesn't stop with one company. The room murmured in agreement. An organizer from an advocacy group stood up next, outlining plans for petitions, calls to action, and partnerships with lawmakers. The energy in the room shifted from frustration to purpose, and for the first time in days, Michelle felt hope outweighing anger. As the meeting wrapped up, Michelle and Barack lingered near the door, speaking with attendees one by one. Amara, a young journalist who had broken one of the first stories about the airline, approached them. Thank you, Amara said, her voice filled with conviction. This isn't just a story anymore, it's a movement. Michelle smiled. Don't stop pushing, she said. I won't, Amara replied. By the time they returned home, the exhaustion had settled deep in Michelle's bones, but her mind refused to rest. She sat by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets, and thought about what lay ahead. The airline's reforms were a start, but Michelle knew that real change would require something more, a shift in culture, not just policy. And that shift would only happen if people refused to look away. She thought about the passengers on that flight, the ones who had watched in silence, the ones who had whispered and judged, and the ones who had spoken up after the fact. She thought about the comments online, the messages of support mixed with vitriol, and she thought about the people who had reached out, like Lucia, who had risked everything to speak the truth. Barack joined her at the window, his presence grounding her as it always did. You're still thinking about it, he said. How can I not? Michelle replied. We've come this far, but it doesn't feel finished. Barack nodded. It's not, he said, but we've started something, and sometimes that's enough to keep going. Michelle leaned into him, letting the warmth of his presence ease the weight on her shoulders. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it had begun, and as Michelle sat there, listening to the rain and feeling the steady rhythm of Barack's breathing beside her, she knew they wouldn't stop until the skies were clear. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family to keep the conversation going, and check out our other videos to explore more stories that inspire change and challenge injustice.